August 1944, Normandy, France. The war in the West was supposed to be over in months. Yet, when German officers stumbled upon what lay behind the American advance, they froze. Before them stretched rows upon rows of fuel drums disappearing into the horizon like an industrial ocean. Rivers of gasoline-fed trucks, tanks, aircraft flowing through makeshift pipelines buried under hedgerows and roads, pulsing with the rhythm of an unstoppable machine. One officer later wrote in his diary, "It was not their tanks that defeated us, it was their fuel." The Germans had believed logistics would cripple the Allies. Instead, they found a miracle of supply that defied every calculation, every assumption, every hope. This is the story of the depots that shocked the Wehrmacht, and how industrial power, not strategy, not courage, won the war. War is often remembered by battles, generals, and flags on maps. But beneath every tank and bomber was something far less romantic fuel. When the Allies landed in Normandy, their tanks burned through nearly 1 million gallons of gasoline a day. Every shell, every ration, every movement forward depended on it. The roar of engines, the thunder of aircraft overhead, the grinding advance of armor across French soil, all of it ran on oceans of petroleum. The Germans believed this would be the Allies' undoing. Europe had few usable ports. Railways lay in ruins from years of bombing. Roads had been cratered, bridges destroyed, entire villages reduced to rubble. How could an army of over 2 million men keep moving across a shattered continent? How could supply lines stretch from England to the Rhine without collapsing under their own weight? The answer began not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, methodical work of engineers, quartermasters, and truck drivers. People who would never be remembered as heroes, yet without whom victory was impossible. They built pipelines under oceans. They erected cities of fuel in conquered fields. They drove through darkness and danger night after night, keeping the lifeblood of war flowing forward. The story of the American fuel depots in France is not just about logistics. It's about a civilization's capacity for movement, for organization, for transforming raw industrial might into decisive military power. It's about the moment when the enemy realized too late that they were fighting something unprecedented. June 1944. The beaches of Normandy still smoked with battle. Soldiers dug into hedgerows, fought for every field, every village. But behind them, invisible to German eyes, another kind of war was already being won. Fuel tankers crossed the Atlantic by the hundreds. Engineers laid pipeline on ocean floors. Depots rose from mud and grass, storing millions of gallons in makeshift cities of steel drums. By August, the German High Command began to understand. By autumn, their own fuel reserves had dwindled to nothing. By winter, they knew the truth. They were fighting an industrial power beyond imagination. And the depots, those endless fields of fuel shimmering under the French sun, were the proof. Every mile the American army advanced consumed a miracle of logistics. A single Sherman tank burned 2 gallons of gasoline per mile, not in combat, just moving. A bomber group required 60,000 gallons for a single mission. A supply convoy crossing from the coast to the front lines drank fuel like a thirsty giant, insatiable and relentless. To move the Allied armies from Normandy to the Rhine, planners calculated a simple staggering formula: 1 gallon per man per day. The result was almost incomprehensible. Over 10 million gallons daily by autumn 1944, more fuel in a week than some nations used in a year. The solution had to be industrial in scale. Tank farms rose near the beaches, hastily constructed but precisely organized. Inland depots fed the front through thousands of trucks, moving in endless convoys that stretched across the French countryside like steel serpents. The Americans called it the Red Ball Express, a ceaseless artery of motion pumping the lifeblood of war from coast to combat. For the Germans watching from their defensive positions, it was unthinkable. They had trained for strategy and discipline. Their officers studied Clausewitz, mastered the art of maneuver, prided themselves on tactical brilliance. The Americans, it seemed, had mastered something far more devastating: mathematics. German panzer divisions moved with precision, but scraped by on fuel rations that grew thinner each month. American armored columns rolled forward with a kind of mechanical inevitability, never stopping, never slowing, because behind them flowed an endless supply. It wasn't courage that made the difference. Both sides had that in abundance. It was capacity, the ability to keep moving when logic said you should stop. The power to advance, not because your soldiers were braver, but because your trucks were fuller. American planners understood something fundamental. Modern war was no longer about who fought hardest, but who could sustain the fight longest. Victory belonged to whoever could keep their engines running. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Each American soldier consumed 10 times more fuel than his German counterpart. Not because Americans were wasteful, but because American doctrine embraced mobility as its core principle. Trucks instead of horses, tanks instead of infantry, aircraft instead of artillery. Movement was freedom. Fuel was movement. Therefore, fuel was freedom. The Germans had built an army designed for short, decisive campaigns. Their logistics assumed quick victories, supply lines measured in weeks, not months. They had conquered France in 6 weeks after all. Why prepare for longer? But now they faced an enemy who prepared for everything, who calculated not just for victory, but for the sustained effort required to reach it, who understood that the real battle wasn't fought at the front lines, but in the supply depots hundreds of miles behind them. By late summer 1944, the contrast was stark. American units sometimes had more fuel than they needed, dumps overflowing tankers waiting to unload. German units rationed every drop, stretching reserves that should have lasted days into weeks through sheer desperation. One captured German logistics officer, interrogated in September, simply shook his head when asked about American supply capabilities. "We knew you had more," he said quietly. "We did not know you had everything." The depots told the story in stark visual terms. Millions of 55-gallon drums stacked in geometric precision, pipelines snaking across fields, tanker trucks in columns that stretched beyond sight. It looked less like a military operation and more like an industrial transplant, as if entire oil fields had been picked up from Texas and Louisiana and dropped onto French soil. The Germans had fought the enemy. They could see soldiers, tanks, planes. They never understood the real enemy was invisible. It was efficiency, abundance, the cold mathematics of industrial power. Before the first tank rolled onto French soil, the Allies had already built their lifeline. It was called WW2 Pipeline under the ocean. The concept seemed impossible. Lay a pipeline across one of the world's busiest shipping channels through currents and tides under constant threat of German discovery. Pump fuel from British refineries directly to invasion beaches, bypassing ships entirely. Create an umbilical cord of steel connecting two nations across 20 miles of churning seawater. Yet by D-Day, engineers had already begun. The pipes were flexible, steel-reinforced wound on massive spools like thread on enormous bobbins. Each could stretch across 30 miles of sea laid from specialized ships that moved slowly across the channel, unreeling the line behind them, like patient spiders spinning impossible webs. Two major lines emerged, Hayes and Hamel, named after the companies that designed them. Different engineering approaches, same audacious goal, both worked. The operation was conducted in near-total secrecy. German intelligence never suspected. Why would they? Who would imagine pumping fuel under an ocean? It defied conventional military thinking. Tankers made sense. Pipelines belonged on land, not ocean floors. But the Allies weren't thinking conventionally. By late 1944, Pluto delivered nearly 1 million gallons of fuel daily. Silently, invisibly, constantly. No ships to sink, no convoys to attack. Just steady, relentless flow from British refineries to French depots, turning the English Channel into the world's largest gas station. The engineering challenges were immense. Ocean currents tried to tear the pipes loose. Tides flexed the lines. Temperature changes caused expansion and contraction. Yet the system held, maintained by crews who worked in secrecy, knowing their pipeline might be the difference between victory and stalemate. German naval observers watched Allied shipping with confusion. The math didn't add up. Not enough tankers crossed the channel to supply the massive fuel consumption they were witnessing. Where was it all coming from? They never found out. Not until after surrender. When captured, German officers were finally shown Pluto's operations in 1945. They stood in silence. One engineer examined the junction stations where pipeline met shore, studying the pumps and valves with professional admiration mixed with despair. "An industrial masterpiece," he said quietly. Another officer, a logistics specialist, simply laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "We built the Atlantic Wall to stop your ships. You went under it with pipes." The irony was profound. Germany had spent years fortifying coastlines, positioning artillery, laying mines, preparing for the invasion they knew would come. They had imagined every possible Allied strategy: massive air support, naval bombardment, airborne drops, armoured thrusts. They never imagined plumbing. Pluto represented something deeper than clever engineering. It symbolized a fundamental difference in how the two sides approached war. The Germans built fortresses, static defensive, designed to stop movement. The Americans built arteries, flexible offensive, designed to enable it. One side thought in terms of barriers, the other thought in terms of flow. The pipeline crews who maintained Pluto never saw combat. They worked in pump stations and junction points, monitoring pressure gauges and checking seals. Their battlefield was measured in pounds per square inch, not captured territory. Yet their contribution was as vital as any infantry division. Every gallon that flowed through those submerged pipes was a gallon that didn't need a tanker. Every tanker freed up could carry other supplies, ammunition, food equipment. The multiplier effect was enormous. By war's end, Pluto had pumped over 170 million gallons beneath the channel, enough to fuel entire armoured divisions, enough to power the liberation of a continent, and the Germans never saw it coming. Because they had been watching for armies and fleets, weapons and warriors. They hadn't been watching for engineers with pipes and mathematical precision, quietly building the infrastructure of victory beneath the waves. In the late summer of 1944, over 6,000 trucks thundered across France every day. Each carried one mission: keep the fuel flowing. The Red Ball Express, named after railroad terminology for priority freight, became the pulse of the Allied advance. A human river of steel and diesel flowing day and night without pause, without rest, because to stop meant the front stopped. 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers, many from segregated units given this dangerous, unglamorous task. They drove trucks through bombed roads under intermittent fire without headlights to avoid German aircraft. They navigated by memory and instinct through French countryside they'd never seen before, carrying 5-ton loads over roads built for horses and carts. If we stopped, one driver recalled years later, his voice still carrying the weight of those months, the front stopped. We knew it, they knew it, so we didn't stop. The convoys moved in organized chaos. Trucks spaced 200 feet apart, engines roaring, gears grinding wheels, churning through mud and dust depending on the weather. Drivers worked shifts that blurred into exhaustion, 18 hours, 20 hours, sometimes more. Coffee and cigarettes became fuel for the men who hauled fuel for the war. They worked without adequate rest, hauling 5,000 tons daily, improvising repairs with spare parts scavenged from wrecked vehicles. When pumps failed, they transferred fuel by hand. When roads were blocked, they carved new paths through fields. When bridges collapsed, they forded streams. The Red Ball Express became more than a supply line. It became a symbol of willpower, translated into motion of human endurance, maintaining mechanical momentum. The routes were marked with red balls painted on trees and signposts, hence the name. One way in, one way out. Civilian traffic was banned. Military police enforced absolute priority. Nothing interrupted the flow. German forces watching from defensive positions saw the convoys and understood their significance. They tried to interdict them with artillery, with airstrikes, with ambushes, but the trucks kept coming, always, relentlessly, like a tide that never ebbed. The contrast with German logistics was devastating. Wehrmacht supply columns moved with horses, literally. Horses pulling wagons, horses carrying supplies, hundreds of thousands of horses requiring their own feed and care. Horses that couldn't move faster than walking speed, that needed rest, that died from exhaustion or Allied strafing. The Americans moved with engines, trucks that could run 20 hours straight, that could be repaired with wrenches instead of veterinary care that multiplied human capacity by orders of magnitude. One captured German officer, watching a Red Ball convoy pass during his transport to a prisoner camp, counted trucks for 15 minutes before giving up. "Your army moves like a machine," he told his guard. "Ours moved like a memory." The drivers themselves rarely received recognition during the war. They were support troops, not combat soldiers. They didn't storm beaches or capture cities. They just drove, night after night, mile after mile, keeping the war machine fed. But they knew their worth. They saw it in the gratitude of infantry officers when fuel trucks arrived. They heard it in the roar of tank engines starting up after resupply. They felt it in the forward momentum of entire divisions that depended on the gasoline they delivered. Years later, historians would calculate the numbers. Over 12,000 tons of supplies moved daily at the express's peak, 400 million ton-miles of freight in 83 days of operation. Statistics that barely captured the human reality, the exhaustion, the danger, the grinding repetition of men who turned logistics into victory. The Red Ball Express ran from August to November 1944 until improved port facilities and restored railways could take over. But in those crucial months, it was the artery that kept Allied armies alive. A rolling lifeline, driven by men who proved that courage isn't only found in combat, but in the relentless, unglamorous work of keeping others in the fight. Behind the front lines, cities of fuel rose from the mud. At Chartres, one depot held over 4 million gallons. Near Cherbourg, another sprawled for miles, rows of 55-gallon drums, shimmering in the summer heat, stacked with geometric precision, creating horizons of steel that caught the light like industrial lakes. Each site was a target waiting to ignite. A single incendiary bomb, one stray artillery shell, and millions of gallons would transform into an inferno that could be seen from miles away. Yet they survived, protected by camouflage discipline and the sheer organizational capacity of the Quartermaster Corps. Engineers built these storage facilities from nothing. They arrived in fields, still bearing the scars of recent combat in clearings, where German troops had camped weeks before, and transformed them into functional fuel depots within days. Pipes were laid over fields, snaking between hedgerows and across dirt roads. Pumps were powered by salvaged engines, by generators trucked in from ports, by whatever worked. Storage tanks appeared where none existed, either brought intact or assembled on-site from components that arrived in pieces. The scale defied comprehension. At the peak of operations, American forces in France maintained over 300 fuel distribution points. Some were small roadside dumps, barely more than a few hundred drums. Others were massive installations that functioned as temporary refineries, complete with filtration systems, testing labs, and fire suppression equipment. By autumn, the Americans had created a network of floating infrastructure, mobile storage towns that could be expanded, relocated, or dismantled based on the front's shifting demands. It was logistics as improvisation, supply as art form. The depots required constant maintenance. Drums leaked, pumps failed. Weather threatened everything. Rain turned storage areas into mud bogs. Summer heat caused expansion that burst seals. Winter cold made fuel viscous and difficult to pump. But the engineers adapted. They built drainage systems. They constructed wooden platforms to keep drums above water. They mixed additives to prevent fuel from gelling in cold weather. They solved problems that military manuals had never anticipated, because those manuals assumed you'd have proper facilities, permanent infrastructure, time to build correctly. The Americans had none of those luxuries. So they built anyway with whatever materials were available, following principles of function over form, speed over perfection. German prisoners working as laborers in these depots stood speechless at the scale. They had served in armies where fuel arrived in jerry cans, carried by hand, rationed by the liter. Now they stood in fields containing millions of gallons, watching American soldiers pump fuel as casually as if drawing water from a well. It looked, one former Wehrmacht soldier recalled, like America itself had come to France. Not just soldiers, but the whole country, the factories, the oil fields, everything. The depots also revealed something about American military culture. There was no aristocratic disdain for logistics, no sense that supply work was beneath a soldier's dignity. Officers who supervised fuel depots were respected, not scorned. The men who maintained pumps and inventoried drums understood they were as essential as those who pulled triggers. German military tradition had always elevated combat over support, warrior spirit over material concerns. It was a romanticism that cost them dearly. The Americans embraced a different philosophy. War was work, and all work contributing to victory deserved respect. The man who kept the pumps running was as valuable as the man who drove the tank those pumps supplied. Visiting the fuel depots became a surreal experience for anyone who remembered pre-war Europe. In fields where farmers had grown wheat and raised cattle, industrial installations now sprawled across the landscape. The smell of gasoline overpowered everything, thick, acrid, inescapable. At night, the depots hummed with activity. Trucks arrived, were filled, departed. Generators pulsed. Voices called out in the darkness. It never stopped, this mechanical breathing, this industrial heartbeat keeping armies alive. By late 1944, German armies were running on fumes, literally. Allied bombers had systematically destroyed their synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pollitz, the industrial hearts that had kept the Wehrmacht moving. What had once produced thousands of tons of fuel monthly now lay in ruins, twisted metal and shattered concrete, testament to the vulnerability of centralized production. A panzer division might receive a quarter of its fuel allowance, sometimes less. Commanders learned to plan operations around fuel availability rather than tactical opportunity. The question was no longer where should we attack, but where can we reach, with what little we have. Tanks were abandoned, not from combat damage, but from empty fuel tanks. Crews left them by roadsides, drained of gasoline, mechanically sound, but utterly useless. Steel coffins that could have held a position could have made a difference, rendered irrelevant by the absence of a few dozen gallons. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, sat grounded on airfields across Germany. Pilots with hundreds of hours of training waited beside aircraft that would never fly again. Not because they lacked courage or skill, but because their fuel tanks stayed empty while Allied bombers roamed overhead with impunity. German soldiers resorted to bicycles, to horses, to walking. Some units literally pulled supply carts by hand, like medieval armies transported into the 20th century against their will. The Wehrmacht had become a stationary force, trying to fight a war of movement. Every tactical advantage they possessed, their experienced officers, their defensive positions, their knowledge of terrain meant nothing when they couldn't maneuver to exploit opportunities or respond to threats. Meanwhile, across the front, the Americans overflowed with fuel. Depots in France alone stored more gasoline than Germany could produce in an entire year. The disparity was so vast, it became almost abstract, a difference in kind rather than degree. One side swam in fuel, the other drowned in its absence. The imbalance was total and devastating. German commanders issued increasingly desperate orders: use horses for all non-combat transport, restrict vehicle movement to absolute necessities, conserve fuel for counterattacks that might never come. They were trying to fight an industrial war with pre-industrial logistics. Captured German documents revealed the desperation in stark mathematical terms. A single panzer division required 500 cubic meters of fuel for basic operations. They were receiving 50, a 90% shortfall that rendered elaborate tactical plans into useless paperwork. The Germans had courage. They had tactical skill honed by years of warfare. They had soldiers willing to die for every meter of ground. But courage can't power a tank. Tactical brilliance means nothing when your forces can't reach the battlefield. The Allies had transformed warfare into a contest of industrial capacity, and in that contest, Germany had already lost. One Wehrmacht logistics officer, writing in his journal during the retreat through France, captured the despair. We see their aircraft overhead constantly. We hear their trucks on every road. We watch their tanks advance while ours sit silent, beautiful machines made worthless by empty fuel lines. We are not being defeated, we are being suffocated. The psychological impact was as devastating as the tactical one. German soldiers watched Allied forces move with a freedom they could only remember not experience. They saw convoys of fuel trucks and knew their own armies would never have such abundance again. It bred a particular kind of hopelessness. Not the hopelessness of combat where courage might make a difference, but the hopelessness of mathematics, where no amount of bravery could overcome simple arithmetic. The Germans had trained for war. The Americans had industrialized it. And in that transformation, in that shift from warfare as art to warfare as production, Germany had become obsolete. Not because their soldiers were inferior, but because their entire military system belonged to an era that petroleum had already rendered extinct. After Germany's surrender, Allied officers took German generals to see the American depots still operating in France. What they saw was incomprehensible. Tank farms stretching beyond sight. Rows of drums creating metallic horizons that shimmered in the May sunshine. Pipelines still pumping fuel eastward, their steady pulse unchanged by the war's end. Airfields supplied like cities with storage capacities that exceeded entire German army groups. The German officers walked through these installations in silence. Some took notes, professional habit, overcoming defeat. Others simply stared, faces blank with the shock of understanding arriving too late to matter. One general, his uniform still bearing the insignia of rank that now meant nothing, murmured, "We had no idea." Another, a logistics specialist who had spent the war struggling to supply 3 divisions, admitted quietly, "If I had seen this in 1944, I would have surrendered then. We were not fighting an army. We were fighting a system." The word hung in the air, inadequate but accurate. They toured the Chartres depot, where millions of gallons sat stored in organized abundance. An American captain explained the distribution network with casual pride, how fuel flowed from here to forward positions, how the system could adapt to changing front lines, how redundancy was built into every level. The German generals listened with the attentiveness of students learning their own obsolescence. At Cherbourg, they watched trucks being fueled, the process so routine it had become mundane to American crews. 55 gallons pumped in minutes, truck pulls away. Next truck pulls forward. Again, again, again. A mechanical rhythm that had been sustained for months without pause. "How many gallons per day?" one German asked. "This depot, about 200,000. On average." The German did the mental calculation, converting to the liters he was accustomed to. His face went pale. "That is more than our entire Western Front received in a week." "Yes, sir," the American said, not unkindly. "I expect it was." Their belief in tactical genius had met a different kind of warfare, a war of supply fought with factories and freight trains, won in oil refineries and port facilities thousands of miles from any battlefield. One captured field marshal examining the pipeline junction stations where Pluto connected to inland distribution networks shook his head slowly. "We studied Clausewitz, we mastered maneuver warfare, we prepared for every tactical scenario." He paused, hand resting on a valve that still flowed with fuel. "But this we never imagined." The revelation was almost philosophical in its weight. They had fought the war, they understood the war, their training and tradition had prepared them for. A war of movement and encirclement, of tactical brilliance and operational art. They lost to a war of capacity and sustainment, of industrial logistics and mathematical certainty. Germany had fought a 19th century war against a 20th century machine. Their cavalry traditions, their aristocratic officer corps, their romantic notions of warrior spirit, all of it had crashed against the cold reality of American industrial power. The irony was bitter. German engineering was legendary. Their tanks were superior in many technical aspects. Their tactical doctrine was more sophisticated. Their soldiers were experienced, disciplined, formidable. But they had never grasped the fundamental truth of modern warfare, that victory belongs not to who fights best, but to who can keep fighting longest. The American depots proved it in stark visual terms. This wasn't just military superiority. This was civilizational capacity made manifest, the ability of an industrial society to project its productive power across an ocean and sustain operations that would have been impossible a generation earlier. One elderly German general who had served in the First World War, and this one stood watching fuel being pumped and spoke quietly to no one in particular. "We thought we were fighting America. We were fighting American abundance. There is no strategy against abundance. Every drop of gasoline that flowed into France had begun a world away in Texas oil fields, Louisiana refineries, and Pennsylvania rail yards. This was the invisible army behind the army, the thousands of workers who never saw combat but made combat possible. Roughnecks drilling in West Texas heat, refinery operators monitoring cracking towers in Baton Rouge. Railroad men coupling tanker cars in freezing Pittsburgh winters. They worked shifts around the clock, knowing their labor fed a war effort across an ocean. Each barrel processed, each tanker car filled, each pipeline valve opened small acts multiplying into strategic consequence. Tankers crossed the Atlantic under constant submarine threat. The men who crewed them knew the statistics: 1 in 4 merchant ships sunk in the early war years. They went anyway because fuel in Texas meant nothing if it couldn't reach France. The convoy system protected them as best it could, but the journey remained dangerous. U-boats lurked, storms threatened. A tanker carrying thousands of gallons of volatile fuel was a floating bomb, one torpedo from catastrophe. Yet they came. Week after week, month after month, an endless flotilla carrying America's industrial lifeblood to European shores. Engineers rebuilt ports that had been demolished in fighting. Cherbourg, heavily damaged during its liberation, was processing fuel within weeks. Antwerp, its harbour complex sabotaged by retreating Germans, was restored to operation through round-the-clock work that ignored exhaustion and danger. They laid pipelines faster than Europe could destroy them. Where bridges had fallen, they ran lines across riverbeds. Where roads were bombed, they buried pipes alongside railway tracks. They improvised solutions to problems that military manuals claimed required months to solve, solving them instead in days. This was not luck or chance. It was industrial orchestration, millions of workers, engineers, and soldiers moving as one synchronized system. Each component understood its role. Each understood that failure anywhere meant failure everywhere. The oil companies cooperated with government in ways peacetime would never see. Competitors shared tankers. Refineries coordinated production. Industry put aside profit motive for production quotas, understanding that victory was good for business only if victory came. American industrial capacity was the true weapon. Not any single tank or bomber, but the ability to produce them in thousands. Not the courage of individual soldiers, but the system that could equip, supply, and sustain millions of them simultaneously. The statistics became almost meaningless through sheer scale. The United States produced more petroleum in 1944 than all other nations combined. American refineries could process in a day what German synthetic plants produced in a month, before Allied bombers reduced those plants to rubble. But numbers alone don't capture it. The real miracle was organization. The ability to move resources from extraction to refinement to transportation to distribution to frontline use, coordinating across thousands of miles and millions of participants without the system collapsing under its own complexity. The Germans had fought the enemy. They could see soldiers on battlefields, tanks on roads, bombers in skies. They never realized the real enemy was invisible. Efficiency distilled into doctrine. Abundance transformed into strategy. Industrial will channeled into military might. America's strength wasn't that it had more fuel. Every nation understood material advantages. America's strength was that it had created systems to exploit that advantage fully, to transform raw resources into sustained operational capability. The depots in France were merely the final expression of a chain that stretched back across an ocean, across an entire continent, connecting oil fields to battlefields through human organization and mechanical precision. When German generals finally saw these systems in their totality, they understood they had never been fighting just the Allied armies in Europe. They had been fighting American factories in Detroit, refineries in Texas railways, crisscrossing a continent they would never see. They had been fighting a nation that could outproduce, outmove, and outlast any enemy through the simple, devastating application of industrial capacity to military purpose. The war had many turning points, but perhaps the truest one was invisible, the moment American fuel systems began operating at full capacity, and victory became not probable but inevitable. In the aftermath of war, the great depots emptied. The drums rusted in French fields, abandoned monuments to industrial effort. The pipelines were dismantled, their steel repurposed for peacetime needs. The tank farms were demolished, leaving only rectangular depressions in the earth where millions of gallons once sat. But the idea remained. Modern warfare had changed forever. No longer a contest of courage alone, but of capacity. No longer measured purely in divisions captured or battles won, but in gallons consumed and tons delivered. The German generals had seen the truth too late, that wars are won not only by those who fight, but by those who feed the fight. That valor and tactical brilliance matter less than the ability to sustain operations across time and distance. The mathematics of victory had become industrial. Historians would later debate which battles mattered most, which generals showed greatest skill, which decisions proved decisive. But perhaps the real decision had been made years before the first shot was fired, made in the oil fields and refineries, in the engineering schools and logistics departments, in the unglamorous work of building systems that could supply a war across an ocean. Behind every American tank in France stood 1,000 unseen hands, roughnecks and refinery workers, engineers and truck drivers, port laborers and pipeline crews. The invisible army that turned industrial capacity into military reality. They transformed petroleum into power. Not just mechanical power, the ability to move tanks and fly bombers, but strategic power. The freedom to advance when enemies could only defend, the luxury of planning operations based on opportunity rather than scarcity. In the end, fuel was not just energy. It was freedom, distilled, stored, and delivered. Freedom to move, to strike, to sustain effort until victory arrived. The depots are gone now. Grass grows where fuel once pooled. French farmers till fields that once held America's strategic reserves. But the lesson remains carved not in monuments, but in understanding that modern power flows through logistics, that wars are won in warehouses as much as battlefields, and that the nation which masters supply masters victory itself. One German officer, years later in his memoirs, summed it up in quiet disbelief. "We did not lose to men, we lost to a system." The sight of those endless depots of oil flowing through conquered lands like rivers through valleys was more than defeat. It was revelation. The world had entered a new era where power was measured not in soldiers but in supply lines, not in courage but in capacity, not in tactics but in tonnage. And so when they saw the depots, those oceans of fuel shimmering under the French sun, those pipelines pumping beneath the channel, those convoys thundering through darkness, the German generals finally understood. This was not just the end of a war, it was the dawn of modern power. The moment when industrial civilization proved it could project itself across continents and oceans, sustaining operations that previous generations would have deemed impossible. War changes men. It takes their youth, their innocence, sometimes their lives. But logistics changes history. And in those French fields, amid the rusting drums and dismantled pumps, lay proof that the future belonged to those who mastered not just the art of war, but the science of supply.